I would like to welcome all of today's participants and our guests to Brooklyn Law School. A number of years ago, we founded the Center for the Study of Law, Language, and Cognition in order to bring together, on a regular basis, scholars from various disciplines to explore important legal issues. Our most recent two symposia, The Jury in the 21st Century and Cognitive Legal Studies, have been published by the Brooklyn Law Review and contain important interdisciplinary scholarship. Today's program continues this tradition by bringing together scholars with backgrounds in law, psychology, linguistics, and philosophy, as well as our future programs will do the same, and we plan to have issues that we plan to study such issues as corporate governance and the interpretation of statutes from these varying perspectives. I'm also pleased to announce today that our center will soon become a venue for assisting young scholars to launch careers in the area of law, language, and cognition. And I've authorized the center to offer a postdoctoral fellowship in this area for next academic year. So we'll start with one, and we hope that the program will grow. Today's symposium on responsibility and blame is all too timely. Terrorist attacks in this city, in Washington, and recently in Indonesia, the threat of war in Iraq, the disclosure of one financial scandal after another, have forced us all to ask serious questions about blame and about how to hold wrongdoers responsible for their actions. Perhaps it is always the case that soul-searching comes at times of crisis, and clearly we are at such a point now. We live under a rule of law, and our legal system purports to establish through our body of laws just when a person or corporation has engaged in legally blameworthy conduct and what should be done when that happens. An overriding theme of today's conference will be a rather frightening question. What should we do if we learn that people really assign responsibility and blame in ways that are different from the ways that the legal system assumes to be true? Most importantly, we must ask whether adjustments are necessary to align the legal system with its stated goal of doing justice. These are among the crucial questions that today's speakers and discussants will be addressing. And before we get underway, I want to thank Michelle Scotto, Director of Special Events, and her staff for making everything go smoothly, at least so far, and you all got here. The students in our law review who will be working on the symposium issue, and all of our participants and guests for joining us. To get started, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Larry Solin, the director of our Center for the Study of Law, Language, and Cognition. Larry is a well-known scholar in the area of linguistics and law. He is also a wonderful teacher and a fine colleague. Larry never turns me down when I ask him to do something. The dean's, dream member of the team. But most importantly, every time I ask him to do something, he always does it well. So I'm sure that today will be no exception. Larry.
Well, I was about to begin by saying that we are I'd like to proceed as the moderator of the first session by not introducing the panelists, except to say what they're going to be talking about in their affiliations. After Joan's introduction of me, that sounds very self-serving. I had no idea she was going to say those things. I'd like to say that Joan is a dean, that while I say yes to her, she says yes to us, and it is Brooklyn Law School and Dean Joan Wexler who has funded this program and all of the programs and the postdoctoral fellowship and everything else that we're doing. This is a very, very supportive academic environment and a wonderful place to be. Well, our first, we've divided the day into 4 panels of either 2 or 3 speakers and a discussant in each case. And the way we're going to proceed is to have each speaker talk for about 20 or 25 minutes. And then the discussant will speak for, about 15 minutes or so. And the remainder of the time will be devoted to questions and discussion from everybody else here. So we've tried to leave quite a bit of time for discussion from the other participants and from other people who are here, so that we can run today as much as a conversation as these kinds of situations allow. So let me very briefly introduce the first panel. Our first speaker is Professor Dan Kahan of the Yale Law School, and he's going to speak about the aesthetics of blame in criminal law. And our second speaker is Professor Leonard Kaplan of the University of Wisconsin Law School, and his talk is called Bergman's Shame and the Denial of Responsibility. In your programs are biographical sketches of each of the participants, and rather than repeat them here, I'm just going to hopefully set a tradition for the rest of the day and just refer you to them. Now, having said that, I'm going to violate the rule instantly by introducing our discussant for this session, Tom Tyler, Department of Psychology at New York University. Your original program indicates that Rav Makun was going to be the discussant. He's the co-author of a paper that's going to be given later this morning. And Rob was unable to make it from California because of very pressing personal reasons, and Tom was gracious enough to agree to come and to discuss the first 2 papers. Tom has just come out with a book published by Russell Sage called Trust in the Law, and I'd like to bring that to everybody's attention. And with that, why don't we begin with Dan Kahan?
Thank you very much, Larry. And thank you to the Dean and to the Law School and to the Center for including me in this really wonderful event. I think it's just going to be a wonderful opportunity to exchange ideas, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm kind of glad that we're sitting in this way, because this way we can all sort of keep an eye on each other. I thought what I would do is try to start a fight, because maybe what I can say will be considered really obvious and straightforward to about half the people, and just completely outrageous and intolerable to the rest. But the point basically that I want to make is that the way that criminal law scholarship conventionally understands the relationship between what criminal law scholarship focuses on, doctrine, and what we're talking about today, blame, is almost as wrong as it could be. It's essentially backwards. The way that I think criminal law scholars, theorists think about this, probably we could put it this way, that doctrine essentially is normative for blaming, in the sense that doctrine should, and absent nullification, does determine who legal decision makers blame for what and how much, right? So doctrine is this kind of controlling force. That's the assumption of essentially all the major approaches to the study of criminal law. So you have grand theorists who start maybe with some kind of normative perspective like utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics, whatever it might be, and then try to derive the right doctrines from that, so that the blaming judgments of legal decision makers will be justifiable. Obviously, that assumes doctrine is going to exert this controlling force. But it's also the assumption of another group, and maybe John Darley and his collaborator, Paul Robinson, are in this group. They think actually what you should do is liberate blaming sensibilities from doctrine. That there's an important reason that the law should match the blaming sensibilities of ordinary citizens. So what they want to do is identify the discrepancies between doctrine and blaming sensibilities and to fix doctrine where you have that kind of discrepancy. Obviously that discrepancy is something to worry about only if you think that doctrine is normative for blaming sensibilities in the sense I described. And what I want to suggest is that there's really no reason to think that doctrine is normative for blaming sensibilities in that sense. It isn't the case, I'm going to say, that people, legal decision makers or anybody else, determines who to blame by consulting doctrine. What they do is identify who should be blamed through a kind of faculty, I'm going to call it affective perception. And then once they do that, they conform the doctrine to that intuition, right? So really, it isn't the case that doctrine is normative for blaming sensibilities. It's that blaming sensibilities are normative for doctrine. And that has important implications, and not really good implications for the way that we now study criminal law. I mean, you can already see that maybe I'm suggesting there's a kind of confusion there, but I also want to suggest that the confusion in some sense is pernicious, that it has a bad consequence that we ought to be concerned about. All right, so let me try to fill this out. And I want to start out with this claim that blaming sensibilities are normative for doctrine. And this account of how blaming sensibilities work in law is based on an account of how blaming sensibilities work outside of law. Right? So I'm going to kind of give you a model here, and it's a composite model that puts together several overlapping, convergent perspectives, mainly from social psychology, on what the relationship is between the judgments of blame that people make, not necessarily in legal context, in any context, and the vocabulary, the concepts that they usually use to articulate, make sense, explain, maybe justify those blaming attributions, right? The normal vocabulary of blaming is remarkably mechanistic, right? That we have a kind of a blaming template, a blaming model that focuses in the first instance on necessary connections or links between the mind of the putative wrongdoer and the behavior, right? So there the key concept is volition. And then also focuses on necessary connections between the behavior of the actor and either bad consequences in the world, right? So ideas of causation, or if not bad consequences, at least risks, right? And so the normal way, or at least the way that we're invited to think about this, even by the way we talk ordinarily, is that it's our apprehension of these kinds of linkages, right? Voluntariness in the actor, causation between the behavior and the undesirable consequences, that tells us when it is we blame, right? So it's as if we have major premises here. You know, when somebody voluntarily chooses to do something, right, and causes harm, then we blame. Then the minor premises are the facts. So and so did or didn't choose. That so and so's behavior did or didn't cause. Ergo, right? That's at least the way our talking seems to frame things. But it's really a misleading picture, right? That the truth psychologically is very different from this. According to several bodies of literature, we start with the blaming prescription, right? Ascription. We have an intuition, and I'll say it's founded in a kind of faculty of affective perception about the culpability or blameworthiness of the actor. And reflection comes after, right? We don't deduce what the right result is, but we fit the perception of the facts and the doctrine together in a way that is supportive of the intuition. Now, again, this is a composite, and I'll just sketch this out, and we can talk about the different components and sources too, if you like. But start with this idea of affective perception, that people have a capacity to recognize instances of culpable behavior, blameworthy behavior in an essentially a spontaneous way. There are a number of different mechanisms here. One of them is pattern recognition, which is just a ubiquitous cognitive process of identification, classification, by which we rapidly and essentially pre-verbally assimilate phenomena to inventory prototypes, right? And we determine on that basis how to characterize something. And this applies to things as mundane as recognizing faces, or if you're a chess grandmaster, knowing what a good position might be in the chessboard. But it's also something that we do as we make sense of moral phenomena in the world. So that's one mechanism of affective perception. Another is the contribution that emotions make to our moral life. There's a tradition in philosophy, and it finds a fair measure of vindication in contemporary psychology. And John Darley is somebody who's demonstrated this through very interesting techniques, MRIs and so forth. But emotions are to our perception of moral phenomena what essentially sight or smell or hearing or taste is to our perception of physical reality, right? It's through the reactions that events and behavior provoke in us, whether disgust or anger or fear or admiration, that we judge them, that we know whether they're good or bad things. And these processes are essentially spontaneous. They're not a matter of reflective, deductive behavior of the sort that the normal model, right, or even our own language of blaming seems to contemplate. Now, the question could be too, why is it then, if that's how we're perceiving things, do we have the second step of the expression of our blaming judgments in terms of our apprehension of these more mechanistic relationships in the physical world? And there are probably a number of different mechanisms at work here. One might even be a kind of cognitive dissonance avoidance. Once we believe that a certain actor is a good person, we instinctively resist the idea that that person could be responsible for bad things in the world. And by the same token, and probably more recognizably, once we see that somebody is bad, right, then naturally that person is the agent of things that we think are bad in the world, right? So there's that kind of process. There's also a kind of moral selective attention phenomenon, and this has been studied extensively in the field of risk perception. But we're attentive to factual information in the world that's supportive of our moral priors, right? So we take note. We're much more likely to register information, evidence that something we think is bad or somebody we think is bad is causing some bad result in the world, and we suppress information that's essentially contrary to that, right? So together, these mechanisms construct this faculty of affective perception. Now, what is it that the faculty of affective perception is focusing on? And essentially, it's the values and the motives, or maybe even the characters of the putative wrongdoers, right? The prototypes to which we assimilate the putative instances of wrongdoing, right? Is this one of them or not? Are exemplars, essentially, of virtuous behavior, and usually exemplars that are very much tied to the roles that we know people occupy, right? The roles as parents, or as spouses, or as people in position of authority. And we know what it is for somebody to be good at that. We have a sense of what that kind of person is motivated by. And we assimilate the information we get about the behavior of actors in the world to those models. Do they fit or not? Right? And it's the disappointment or satisfaction of the expectation of fit that then is the provoking response of our emotional reaction, right? So in effect, we have emotional responses, right, of contempt, right, or admiration, of fear, right, or of sympathy or empathy toward the perceived emotional sensibilities of other people. And this is the connection, although the connection at this point is becoming secondary as I think about this, between the practice of blaming in aesthetics, right? And there's actually a body of work that I'm thinking of here that assimilates the judgment of blaming in moral evaluating generally to the perception of beauty and ugliness in various phenomena, to a kind of aesthetic judgment, right? So we recognize certain people, or at least when their behavior is framed in a certain way, we recognize them as having characters, motivations, aims that we admire, that we think are beautiful, right? And those are the kind of people that we tend to shield from blame. Others, right, have characters, motives, dispositions that are depraved, right, that are wicked, that are ugly. And those are the people to whom we naturally assign the responsibility for bad things in the world. Right, so that's a kind of overview of a model of blaming, right? The affective perception model, let's call it. It's a composite, again, of different literatures. And what I want to say is that, gee, this is exactly, what's going on in the law, right? The law, like the vocabularies we have for articulating the judgments of blame, consists of a large number of fairly mechanistic doctrines, ones that focus in part on the connection between the mind and the behavior of the wrongdoer, they're voluntarist in nature, and others that talk about the necessary connection between behavior and results, right? Causal connections or concepts of risk. So think about the voluntary act requirement, right? The idea is that you can't have any criminal liability unless somebody has behaved voluntarily, there's got to be a voluntary act out there, says the doctrine. Or imagine the person who engages in intentional homicide, but in the heat of passion, right? It's sort of in the grip of the passion that displaces reason, right? In the absence of cooling time and so forth, or maybe just the language, a more contemporary idiom from the model penal code. The extreme emotional disturbance, right? When a person is in that condition, when there's a breakdown in the necessary link between mind and behavior, then there's mitigation, right? Or maybe even there's complete excuse. There's the formulation, although it's becoming less and less prevalent, of the irresistible impulse conception, or volitional impairment conception of insanity, right? Or two, if we imagine that somebody's will has been overcome not by something inside of them, but by something outside, like a threat, right? That's sufficiently overbearing to overcome their will, then they have a defense of duress, right? So these are all doctrines that resemble the part of our normal blaming template that focuses our attention on the necessary link between the mind of the actor and the behavior of the actor. Anyone, though, who studied criminal law knows that these doctrines are exceedingly murky and vague. And indeed anybody, or many people who've studied them from a psychological perspective say that they're completely specious. But it's hard to be specious if you don't even have substance, and most of these doctrines don't. The law doesn't define what counts as a voluntary act. It gives us a few examples of things that aren't, but it doesn't tell us what is. It doesn't give us necessary and sufficient conditions for identifying when an act is voluntary. The doctrine doesn't tell us what kinds of mental conditions, diseases, events that trigger an irresistible impulse or volitional impairment or make somebody eligible for the dispensation of the insanity doctrine. Right? So sort of at the front end, we're not sure who we're admitting to this class of volitionally impaired actors. Right? But then it turns out that even if we had admitted you, and in fact we can exclude you on grounds that aren't particularly clear either, because there are all of these normative delimiters on these doctrines, right? Things like, well, it's sure heat of passion, but it better have been produced by an adequate provocation, right? Or extreme emotional disturbance, but you better have a reasonable excuse, right? Or sure, your will was overcome, but only under conditions in which a person of reasonable firmness would have submitted, and so forth and so on. Again, without much specification. So we don't know who's in, and we don't know even who's out of these doctrines that purport to give dispensation to people based on the absence of this necessary link between mind and behavior. Well, juries, judges, they fill in these doctrines on the fly, right, as they consider the cases. And the way they do it is in exactly the way that the affective perception model predicts that they would do it, the same way anybody else does it when they're conforming these kinds of abstract principles and doctrines to their intuitions. Right? They start out with an evaluation of the character of the wrongdoer, right? And then they essentially confabulate, dissemble, not necessarily, they through a process of selective attention or maybe even cognitive dissonance avoidance, naturally conform the doctrinal category to the evaluation of the motivation, value, character of the actors, right? Or at least that's the hypothesis. The hypothesis should be that there should be a correspondence, right, between the people we know fit our prototypes of virtuous actors and the dispensation effect of these doctrines. And anybody who's looked at criminal law knows that that's exactly true, right? So these are oftentimes very gender specific. But the prototype of the good man is the man who's a responsible head of a household, right? And somebody who's owed allegiance from people in the household, and somebody who protects people in the household. And it's somebody whose motivations for violence that we can assimilate to that pattern, that we then say is the person who, when he commits an act of violence, is owed the kind of dispensation of the voluntarist excuse, right? So the irresistible impulse doctrine is one of the central vehicles for the unwritten rule, right, called in criminal law, that the man who kills the seducer of his daughter, the ravager of his daughter, or the paramour of his wife, gets a defense, right? Now, and now sometimes when it's called the unwritten rule, it's thought that the decision makers essentially are nullifying. They're not doing that. Right? They're naturally conforming their perception of what happened in this person's mind, right, to their judgment that this is somebody who doesn't deserve to be blamed because he's a good person. And once you at least are equipped with the kind of tools that the affective perception model gives you, you can find evidence of this in the cases. It's not that hard, right? So here's something that court said. I've been speaking 25 minutes. The time flies, but how can you blame me? The court says that, look, here's a man who he suffered from the irresistible impulse that causes him to kill somebody. And they say, well, what would you expect of a man of good moral character, such as that possessed by the defendant, highly respected in the community, having regard for his duties as a husband and the virtue of women, upon learning of the immorality of his wife, might be shocked, or such knowledge might prey upon his mind and cause temporary insanity. In fact, it would appear that such would be the most likely consequence of obtaining such information, right? So if you're a good person, then you fly off the handle when you have this kind of transgression. But say you're a bad person, right? Somebody who doesn't live up to the expectations of that role. Maybe you're an unfaithful husband, right? So the same court says in another case, if you're an adulterer, well then that evidence should come in so that the jury can draw the inference that somebody who's guilty of those kinds of moral delinquencies wouldn't be shocked, right? Wouldn't experience strain sufficiently great to upset his reason when he finds out that his own wife has been unfaithful, right? He's been doing it himself after all. He can't consider this particularly surprising information, right? Maybe reciprocity, right? So now this is the good man. We have stories about the good woman too, who she, the duress defense tracks are prototype of that. If you're a woman who submits to a threat of physical violence against you or your child, right, and therefore participate in maybe a violent act against another person, you get the duress defense. But if it's that same threat to you, causing you to acquiesce in injury to your child or the abuse of your child, then you don't, right? Now this would be hard to understand if it was the strength of the will that was being measured against the force of the threat, but it's not, right? It's the strength of the character of the woman, and the character of the woman is measured with reference to our prototype of the good mother, right? The good mother will basically sacrifice herself for the child, prefer the child's interest to her own, right? Now, so you can essentially decipher these kinds of prototypes from the law. Let me just quickly say what I think the subversive consequences of this, the troubling consequences of this would be for the traditional ways in which we study criminal law. There are essentially two styles of criminal doctrinal analysis. One is a kind of imperial style, right? It says we have to subdue blaming sensibilities to theories. It tries to prescribe doctrines then that will constrain the blaming judgments of the decision makers, right? Well, the sovereignty of blaming over doctrine suggests that this imperial style of theorizing can never really realize its ambition, right? No matter what doctrines it thinks are best in theory, people will assimilate those doctrines to their intuitions. They'll mean what they think they should mean, right? So theorists have heated debates about the right formulation of insanity doctrine. Is it the cognitive impairment test or the volitional impairment test? Right? It matters a lot, they say. But it doesn't matter at all in practice. Right? There's experimental research showing you give them the ALI instruction, you give them the traditional cognitive impairment, they come out exactly the same way. If you give them no instruction. Right? There's a lay construct of insanity, and it overlaps but doesn't have all that much to do with the kinds of factors that the doctrine says matters. People conform. Their doctrine is colonized by blame, not vice versa. The other approach, and maybe here I can provoke John Darley, who's a good person and who you won't blame then for attacking me. But the other approach is more populist, right? It says we should be conforming law to blaming sensibilities. Because the blaming sensibilities might be presumptively right as a normative matter, but also there might be bad consequences if there were systematic divergences between the law and the blaming sensibilities. Well, I think that anxiety might be overstated, right? It's overstated because there's not much reason to think, if blaming sensibilities are sovereign for doctrine, that doctrine will ever diverge from the blaming sensibilities when they're applied. Right? John Darley and Paul Robinson might, because they're schooled in this, understand the difference between the model penal code formulation of voluntary manslaughter and the common law formulation. Right? But jurors have their own prototypes of the enraged actor who's entitled to dispensation. They're going to conform their understanding, whichever one doctrine you give them, to that. Right? So again, that might be a bit of an overstated anxiety. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is why this is pernicious. And maybe it won't take me that long to get this out, I hope. But here, it should be obvious to you that if what's at stake in the application of blaming doctrine is an understanding of what constitutes a virtuous character, then something very contentious, something very open to dispute, something very deserving of serious evaluation and debate is at stake here, right? I mean, think about the law's understanding of the good woman, right? Who's really a good mother, who subordinates her identity and her autonomy to the obligation she has to provide for the welfare of the child. Maybe that's right, or maybe that's not quite right. Maybe that links up with understandings of status of women and the roles that they occupy that we wouldn't want to endorse upon reflection. Yet that's the raw material of the blaming judgments of law, right? And it's the norm that the doctrine in application tends to reinforce. Nothing in the conventional ways of studying criminal law doctrine, though, focus our attention on that sort of issue, much less give us some way to think about evaluating that and controlling it. But that's what criminal law doctrine ought to be doing if that's what's at stake here. Right? So what I want to say is that we need a new way to do criminal law theory, a way that will involve lots of collaboration between criminal law scholars and people in other disciplines. But we need to have more investigation, more data, more detail on the mechanisms I'm describing that make blaming sensibilities sovereign for doctrine. We need better ways to connect, almost ethnographically, the blaming sensibilities we see and the kinds of norms and expectations people have about virtue that would make them see certain people as responsible or not responsible in different situations, so we can decipher exactly what kinds of inputs are informing the decision making, what kinds of expectations are being reinforced by these decisions. And then finally, we need some way to frame a discussion about whether the implicit understandings of virtue, the implicit understandings of a just society that are motivating these blaming judgments, are the ones we want to live by. And if they're not, some way that we could have control over them. Right? The psychology that I'm talking about suggests that this kind of relationship between the blaming and the doctrinal application might be inevitable, but it doesn't suggest that it has to be inevitably invisible, right, or inevitably beyond our control. Right? So we need to start moving criminal law theory in the direction of making sense of and controlling these processes. Exactly 25 minutes.
Thank you very much. Now, Len Kaplan.
Well, I too wanted to thank the Dean and Larry Solon for the invitation. I think Brooklyn Law School is in the ascendancy. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I start my paper, I should indicate I come from Madison, Wisconsin, but I was born and bred in a suburb of New York, Philadelphia. So it's a pleasure to be back here after a long time. I also come from a state where I don't know what to make of the insanity defense. Before I get into my own paper, it's a place where urban cannibalism is considered sane. Right? I mean, Dahmer was found sane, so... and Dan reminds me why I stopped teaching criminal law. There's a kind of vertigo that is necessarily part of teaching the jurisprudence of criminal law, and I think Dan has identified the significant set of contradictions and tensions. I don't want to scare you, but I'm going to read a couple pages of my paper, then I'll present the rest of it off the top, if you will. I want to read so that way at least I've identified the issues that are of my main concern today. Can you hear me back there? Okay. I want to shift from the kinds of questions that Dan was asking to a whole different set of questions and a whole different way of understanding responsibility. All right? And I want to say that if we locate the notion of responsibility according to McKeon, it wouldn't be until sometime in the 19th century as opposed to looking at virtue theory. And it would be interesting to try and get a sense of the difference between virtue theory, right action, and notions of responsibility. Responsibility is open-ended. And the kind of responsibility I want to talk about today is even more open-ended and problematic than even that contained within the criminal law, it seems to me. So let me read, with your indulgence, a couple pages, and then go on to an oral presentation without the text. Where is this place, Oedipus asked Antigone as they enter Colonus, the famous dwelling place of the transformed Eurynes, the Eumenides? This verse has captured me as powerfully as Hillel's admonition that encapsulated asks, if I do not stand for others, who will stand for me? And continues, and if not now, when? Marx's poverty of philosophy and Lenin's what is to be done. Those are other phrases that come to me and start to anchor this, the concern I have to bring to you today. Oedipus, so shamed at the end of his investigations in Oedipus the Usurper, not Oedipus Rex, but the Usurper, that he puts his eyes out, disavows personal responsibility and blame for his destiny before he ascends to his new metaphysical place in Colonus. He demands that we understand. Hillel and Lenin address us, and they demand that we understand. These are ethical concerns. And so does Bergman. He calls on his audience to understand the world he was living in when he scripted Shame, the movie I'm talking about today, in 1967. We're living in dangerous times. Perhaps all times have been dangerous times, but it seems to me these are particularly dangerous times, and there's a particular sense of distrust, at least that I feel, toward our regime or government, and I think many of us do. We're dealing in Iraq at the same time that we're playing a different kind of game with Korea, and we heard on the TV this morning, if we listened, that The Pakistanis sold the nuclear capacity to the Koreans. It's a globalized economy of terror and mistrust. So this time has global war in the air to protect globalized economies that themselves are summing to some very good for a small part of humanity and not so good for most others. Domestically, almost a banality and a truth. The poor get poorer, the rich richer, the middle class more anxious. We have a crisis in health delivery, a prison industrial complex, continued poverty, a further disaffection from politics and breakdown of political leadership here in much of the world, and a culture of complaint, right? My complaint. At a more institutional level, our courts are more politicized, not a new but a more obvious condition than immediately in the past. Captures of legislatures by corporate interest, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps I'm overstating, but I don't think so. How colored is my consciousness by developmental trauma and adaptive mechanisms? How prescient am I about reading the world as a text in my diagnostic subjectivity? At this point in the essay, what difference does it make to what I owe the world or what it owes me? Or in the terms of this conference, what is my responsibility and what my potential blame, and for what aspect of the world am I responsible? This is beyond deontology. The question entails assessments of epistemological, ontological, ethical, and legal, and more generally political understanding of what responsibility means philosophically, theologically, legally, politically, culturally, etc. And what does theory along any fault line mean for individual and social practice, normatively and empirically? My view is not the view from nowhere, it's from here and now. It is colored by theologies that are committed to the other. It is unhappy with the liberal state, both theoretically and actually, and it prefers the liberal state, theoretically and actually, over many other current alternatives. I can go on, but enough. This essay then contemplates the responsibility of me and you for what is currently happening. It has no great faith in theory or writing against the grain, but that is the practice at hand, and here we are. So I claim and will argue that I and you owe a responsibility to do more than we are doing, but that we have no time or energy to do so, that this has consequences for how we feel about ourselves, about the quality of our lives, and dare I say in a law school, our souls. Nor am I positing any afterlife. This one is scary and fascinating enough. I want to put forward the following claims. One, that as an individual, I am responsible no matter what I do, that neither you or I do enough, that we do not know what to do, that there are structural constraints and distortions that rationalize present quietism, that theory about the state of the state, though engaging at this stage, will be unavailing in shaping particular persons that will be more responsible and effective than we are in defining and addressing what is seized upon as the commodified current evil, the commodification of moral outrage, Barrington Moore, that social and intrapsychic motivational distinctions between shame and guilt explain little about most structural politics and less than we might hypothesize about interpersonal responses, at least for responsible action. This is against the psychoanalytic core. This is my starting place. My object is to get at these issues in Bergman's shame, or the shame as it has been called. I call on Emmanuel Levinas, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Jan Patočka to assess Bergman. And only as a start to the project, which remains inchoate, I start with the assumption of a fallen human nature, or that reason is limited, particularly because of complexity, or that reason is instrumental and no more than a means to satisfy socially induced and frequently stupid and self-harming desires. Okay, enough reading. Now, why? In a full copy of the paper, I would address liberal versus Republican forms of governance. There's extraordinary literature on this. There are implications for the way in which theory claims the self is shaped as autonomous or contingent. It's a rich literature, it's an important literature, and it's totally irrelevant for present concerns. As is much theory, I contend. It's the way in which academics practice so that we can avoid the world and pretend that we're in the world. Okay, now why Bergman shame? Why Bergman in the first place? Well, when I was 16 years old, I shouldn't confess to this, But when I was 16 years old, a friend and I went to a soft porn movie house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so that we could indulge our imaginations. And we went into the movie house expecting to see something titillating, and instead saw Bergman's Through a Glass Darkly. And we came out extraordinarily shaken. And I haven't forgotten or forgiven Bergman since. The reason that happened was because the soft porn movie houses in Philadelphia and around the country legitimated themselves by every now and then showing a foreign film. Right? And so Bergman has stayed with me and plagued me. And this is not the Bergman of Fanny and Alexander. This is the Bergman of Persona and Through a Glass Darkly and The Hour of the Wolf. Shame itself was received. The film was scripted in 1967 during a particular moment of the way in which the Vietnamese War was being received in the world and in Sweden. For those of you old enough to recall, Sweden was one mecca for people to hide against the war. Bertrand Russell, Sartre, etc., had war crimes tribunals in Sweden. Bergman's movie was received by the left in Sweden as an apology for the Vietnamese War. You can't be a hero to your own people. You can't be a hero in your own family. And in fact, the movie did have this checkered reception. And Bergman, who thought he would be a class friend, turned out to be an enemy of the people at that time in that place with respect to this movie. The movie was nominated for an Academy Award for Foreign Pictures in the United States, which perhaps counts against it. I'm not sure. But the movie presents issues that I think are of extraordinary importance and local concern. One way to get at this is to announce the cast of characters. There's Jean and Eva Rosenberg, Max von Sydow and Liv Ullmann. We can pause with Liv Ullmann. I mean, there's my sexism. Von Sydow's okay. There's Jean and Eva Rosenberg. Rosenberg, a name that suggested Judaism, although they're not Jewish, and certainly suggest and invoked World War II, as well as the Vietnamese War, and in fact, the way Bergman finally comes up with the movie All Wars. But the movie's beyond war, and I'll talk about that in a second. Another character is Philippe, who is the head of the resistance during this war. Jacobi, who was mayor of the local town and becomes a quisling, a turncoat. There's an antique dealer as well. Now, the movie takes place with Jean and Eva on an island removed from the mainland. I don't know how many of you here have actually seen the movie. It's worth seeing. It's a powerful movie. But then again, I would rank Bergman in my top three for film directors in the last part of the 20th century, beyond the soft porn aspect. Jan and Eva have separated themselves from the mainland and try to separate themselves from the war. If we turn to Hellenistic philosophy, according to Martha Nussbaum, we can see that one way we can stay alive is to reduce our needs in the world, and if we follow Epicurus, we can remove ourselves from the world and the corruption of the world. And that's exactly what they try to do. Eva is the more dominant of the two to begin with. She's keeping the household. She's making sure that the crop is grown, that there's self-subsistence. She takes care of herself. She takes care of Jan, who is really weak-kneed and a total pain in the butt. He is a hypochondriac. He's a whiner. He sees himself as attacked, and he was a virtuoso, as was she. She turns out to be the first violinist of the symphony before it was disbanded because of this war. But he's even better than that. And he knows that, and we know that because he possesses this rare violin, this Panini, and he tells us the history of it. In the first part of the movie, we watched Eva being very irritated with Jan because he doesn't shave, he's Neither of them are playing music anymore. They're not taking care of themselves, although she's trying to take care of her world. Jacoby is the mayor of this little part of the world. And when the adversary, the enemy, and by the way, both sides in this war wear the same uniforms. They're undifferentiable. We don't know if it's a civil war or if it's a war between nations. This is part of the critique of Bergman. Is he saying that all war is bad and we're nothing but violent? And I want to argue this is beyond war. The war is just a moment. And as a matter of fact, the notion of interregnum is the time when we have peace and due process, which is a very limited time in human history. Mostly we're at war, right? At least in the West. That's part of our ideology, is part of our agon, if you will. And so we're talking about human relations, not only in war, but in pre-war, if you will, or in rationalized peace. Jacoby tries to seduce Eva. He brings to Jan a Dvorak manuscript. He gives Eva significant bit of money. He gives her an heirloom. That's a family heirloom. He comes across as a dignified but needy fellow who desires Eva not so much only sexually, but for her her givingness, for her humanity, for her compassion. But it's very clear that if Jan and Eva turn Jacoby away, that Jacoby is going to get even. He's going to make sure that these people get put into some sort of archipelago and get terribly sanctioned. At the same time, Eva and Jan understand that the resistance, exemplified by Philippe, will get even with them as well for sheltering Jacoby. Bergman said, Bergman's a dramatist. He's a theater person. After Fanny and Alexander, he stops doing films and he does nothing but theater. And this is a very theatrical, very dramatic set of scenes. But what happens is that each particular character turns. And this is not an Aristotelian reversal. It's a much dirtier reversal without self-perception at the end of the game. This is not Oedipus of Colonus, who comes to terms with some degree of acceptance. Not much acceptance. If you remember Oedipus of Colonus, he's not very accepting of his kin structure or of anybody but the gods. All right? And he disavows his own fault, though he accepts the shame of what he's done. Jan has no self-perception. Eva has very little self-perception. Jacoby, who's been a good man, turns out to be a quisling. And Philippe turns sides at the end and gives up the war. All right? Now, I'm not going to give more details on this. I would like a kind of Spockian mind meld so you've seen the movie and we can share it. I might say, as a matter of teaching, one problem with postmodernism for me is that when I've been my most elusive, my students look at me and say, what is he alluding to? Is this a thought disorder? We don't share the same cultural objects, so it's hard to play off of a text in the way in which we presumably did in the past. We don't all, I ask a class, how many people here have read Milton's Paradise Lost? And they all raise their hand, and I say, more than the first act, or more than the first part of the poem. And they say, no, Paradise Regained, forget that. Right? So we have a canon, but the canon, for the most part, is not attended to. Okay, so what I claim about this movie is that what Bergman is showing us are a series of characters. I might say that before the end of the movie, Jan, who is the most weak, turns out to be a murderer. He kills, and he kills gratuitously. He murders. Eva, who turns out to be strong, turns out to be dependent. So all the turnings, all the reversals, end up being depreciated reversals. And what you see here at the end of the day is not shame, but shamelessness. And the point of the movie is the way in which we see. It's for us to see them, and to see the extent to which shame and guilt don't figure into the analysis, into the representation. What happens is we have self-survival, and what we see is a loss of soul in each one of the individuals. Now, why do I turn to Levinas, who's become a cottage industry, or Bonhoeffer, or Ptatka? Well, because what I'm trying to do is to go prior to the Enlightenment, but to keep the good part of the Enlightenment that is still part of the liberal state to some extent. Levinas is somebody who, I might say that Ptatka and Levinas were students of Heidegger. Bonhoeffer obviously was not. But this stuff was in the wind. The way in which one tries to get at being, as Heidegger does, without metaphysical assumptions. And at the same time, to try and establish some sort of ontology that is meaningful beyond the particular moment. Levinas makes a scandalous move. The scandalous move, for those of you who haven't read Levinas, is that ethics precedes being. That is, the only way we can be human is to be ethical. And without doing that, we end up being extraordinarily diminished in terms of the quality of our own lives. And what Levinas argues is, I owe an